Welcome to Order Militarist Radio TV. And in today's show, we are coming back with Anthony Sutton and his book on Wall Street in the Bolshevik Revolution. And today we'll be telling you how the Democrats started the Russian Revolution in America. And we were with Brother Alexis Bonello.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be on Order Militarist Radio TV, the truly uncontrolled, non-Masonic Catholic media outlet in the English-speaking world. And we're making it our mission now to rip the masks off the Freemasons, as Pius X said we should do.
Mm-hmm.
And this will be a series of reports where we're drawing from the wonderful research of Anthony Sutton, who for the last 40 years of his life exposed the deep state and who was behind it, and tied it all back to Skull and Bones.
Yep.
So I'm honored to be the host of today's program. So AJ, we're talking about the Russian Revolution now. So that starts in 1917. It leads to the Bolshevik takeover of Russia, the murder of at least 20 million Russians by starvation, Holodomor.
Mm-hmm.
Talked about that already. Another 20 million in the Second World War, and another 20 million around the world that the Russians promoted. 60 million deaths caused by the people who were behind the Russian Revolution. And we have been taught in public schools for a century now, the fault is them.
Mm-hmm.
The fault's over there. It's the people in Europe. It's Russia. That's where the problem is. But the truth is, it all began in the United States. It was all controlled from the United States, and it was always controlled from the United States. So now we're going to unmask the real history of the 20th century and what they never taught you in public school, because you would be kind of upset that your taxpayers' money was being used to kill 60 million people in the name of godless atheism. So let's start with William Lawrence Saunders. That's Lawrence with the W, not with a U. If you spell it with a U, we're talking about that's a Confederate general in the Civil War. We're not talking, and a member of the KKK. We're not talking about William Lawrence with a U, Saunders. We're talking about William Lawrence with a W, Saunders. So who was he? What did he become? And what letter does he write to Woodrow Wilson that blows open the whole conspiracy?
Mm-hmm. He was born in 1856 to a Reverend William Traybell Saunders and Eliza S. Morton in Columbus, Georgia. His family moved to Apalachia, Florida, where his father became the pastor of the Trinity Protestant Episcopal Church. He married Bertha Louise Gaston on August 3rd, 1886, in Kingston, Rhode Island. They had two daughters, Louise Saunders Perkins and Jean Saunders Lancaster. On March 24th, 1904, he made president of the Ingersoll Sergeant Drill Company after the death of William Russell Grace. In May 1905, Ingersoll Sergeant Drill Company and the Rand Drill Company merged into Ingersoll Rand. He became the first president of the now combined Ingersoll Rand in 1906. He was sighted in North Plainfield, New Jersey. He died on June 25th, 1931 in Tenerife on the Canary Islands. He was buried in Hillside Cemetery in Scotch Plains, New Jersey. He also
go ahead.
It brings out a note at the very end. He also served as the 1915 president of the AIME, American Institute of Mining, Metallurgical and Petroleum Engineers, and deputy chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Yeah, that last little sentence was, I guess, recently added as a footnote to the Wikipedia article, but actually, that's the most important thing in his biography, because that was exposed by Anthony Sutton in his book on Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. So in his capacity as deputy to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is one of the most important of all the reserve banks, and I remind you, the Federal Reserve Bank system was thought up in the boardroom of the Journal of Commerce around 1902, 1903. Remember, we mentioned the other day that Forbes, who founds the Forbes magazine, who gets involved in the conspiracy to crash the market in 29, becomes fably wealthy, has the same family name as the Forbes that are in the Skull and Bones lodges, and was seen in a photo. His son was seen in a photo with Fred Trump sometime in the 70s, I believe it is, or maybe the 80s, and you can find that at Bing Images. It was probably in the boardroom of the Journal of Commerce, they came up with the idea of a Federal Reserve Bank. So the idea of the whole Federal Reserve comes from New York Freemasonry in the banking families. And so a letter from William Lawrence Saunders in his capacity as deputy of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York is no small thing. You don't really put anything in writing, and when you do, you're putting your cards on the table. So Woodrow Wilson, remind everyone, is the Democrat president. He was elected in 1914, I think,
Yeah.
as president of the United States, and he is the one that gets. He says he runs on the platform, "I will keep America out of the war," but he puts America into the war in 1917. He oversees the League of Nations. He insists on the destruction of the Catholic Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the only state in Europe that was dissolved after the war. And is involved in the League of Nations, which is a Masonic organization that has great influence around the whole world, and ends up getting in motion the founding of the modern state of Israel. Yep. So this is a letter between two significant people, and we're going to see that this letter is significant of itself. So AJ, why don't you read the whole letter, the date and everything?
Okay. Letter to President Woodrow Wilson, October 17, 1918, from William Lawrence Saunders, Chairman of Integral Rand Corporation, Director of American International Corporation, and Deputy Chairman, Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Dear Mr. President, I am in sympathy with the Soviet form of government as that best suited for the Russian people.
I am in sympathy with the Soviet form of government as the best form of government for the Russian people. Is that all he says?
Yep.
You know, why do you even have to write a letter like that? But gotta remember, 1917 October, the Tsar has been removed from power. There is a democratic form of government in Moscow, but the people are still Russian Orthodox, devout Russian Orthodox. But a Soviet form of government is completely atheistic and is anti-Christic. So here you have a man whose father was an Episcopalian minister and is basically saying he wants the destruction of the Russian Orthodox Church. If you're Orthodox out there, you should make the program we're doing today go viral and realize who was behind the destruction or the attempted destruction of the Russian people and the Russian Orthodox Church. The Soviet form of government is the best form of government for them. You got to destroy that Christianity. Can't allow it to exist. Can't be tolerated. But think about it a moment. This guy was president of a drilling company. Matter of fact, he was an inventor of mining machinery. So why would he want a state in which everyone is enslaved to work in mines and produce metals at like the lowest possible cost? Unless, of course, what he means by a Soviet system is a system that serves bankers by making huge profits in capitalist enterprises under the pretense of communism. But maybe that would just be an unfair assessment. But let's continue the investigation and see if this thesis is right.
Yeah.
So what is the relationship between the New York bankers and Marxist socialism?
Now, when Anthony Sutton published this book, He had on the front, I think the front piece in the book was a cartoon by cartoonist Robert Minor in 1911 for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Minor was a talented artist and writer who doubled as a Bolshevik revolutionary. Got himself arrested in Russia in 1915 for alleged subversive, and was later bankrolled by prominent Wall Street financiers. Minor's cartoon portrays a bearded, beaming Karl Marx standing in Wall Street with socialism tucked under his arm and accepting the congratulations of financial luminaries J.P. Morgan, partner George W. Perkins, a smug John D. Rockefeller, John D. Ryan of the National City Bank, and Teddy Roosevelt, promptly identified by his famous teeth in the background. Wall Street is decorated by red flags, the cheering crowd, and the Bourne hats suggest Karl Marx must have been a fairly popular sort, a fellow in New York financial district. Was Robert Minor dreaming? On the contrary, we shall see that Minor was on firm ground in depicting an enthusiastic alliance of Wall Street and Marxism socialists. The characters in Minor's cartoon, Karl Marx symbolizing the future revolutionaries of Lenin and Trotsky, J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller, and indeed Robert Minor himself, are also prominent characters in this book. The contradictions suggested by Minor's cartoon have been brushed under the rug of history because they do not fit the accepted conceptual spectrum of political left and political right. Bolsheviks are at the left end of the political spectrum, and Wall Street financiers are at the right end. Therefore, we implicitly reason the two groups have nothing in common, and the alliance between the two is absurd. Factors contrary to this neat conceptual arrangement are usually rejected as bizarre observations or unfortunate errors. Modern history possesses such a built-in duality and certainly, if too many uncomfortable facts have been rejected and brushed under the rug, it is an inaccurate history. On the other hand, it may be observed that both the extreme right and extreme left of conventional political spectrum are absolutely collectivists. The National Socialists, for example, the Fascists, the International Socialists, for example, the Communists, both recommended totalitarian political economic systems based on naked, unfettered political power and individual coercion. Both systems require monopoly of control of society, while monopoly control of industries was one of the objectives of J.P. Morgan and J.D. Rockefeller. By the late 19th century, the inner sanctums of Wall Street understand that the most efficient way to gain an unchallenged monopoly was to go political, to make society go to work for the monopolists under the name of public good and public interest. This strategy was detailed in 1906 by Frederick C. Howe in his Confessions of a Monopolist. Howe, by the way, is also a figure in the story of the Bolshevik Revolution. Therefore, an alternate conceptual packaging of political ideas, political economic systems, would be that of ranking the degree of individual freedom versus degree of centralized political control. Under such an ordering of the corporate welfare state and socialism are at the same end of the spectrum. Hence, we see that attempts at monopoly control of society can have different labels while owning the common features.
Yeah, and we can see this in the scamdemic. One of the close allies of Bill Gates pushing the vaccine here in Italy, during the scamdemic, when they were proposing all kinds of crazy controls to get people to be protected, but it was really to impose Marxism. One of the members of the government, one of the ministers of the Italian government says, if these measures don't work, then we must establish an absolute dictatorship of the proletariat. Those were his exact words on national television. So this is what they're all up to. They're up to total collectivization. And it's not because they're in favor of Marxism. It's because they're in favor of radical capitalism, the enslavement of all the peons and making them work as slaves in their economic system. So So ideologically, we can see that bankers in New York would be very much in favor of Marxist socialism. We're going to see how much in favor they are. So how do the Bolsheviks get funding? And um, do you want to mention now what the party used to be called and how it changed its names 3 times, or we'll get into that?
Let's see. Let's go to it was the Democrat. It was the Democrat Party, the Constitutional Democrat Party.
Yeah, so it first was called the Constitutional Democrat Party. Then it changed its name to the Democrat Party. We're talking about the party in Russia now. Then it changes its name to the Bolshevik Party.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see, I see a trend there. Weren't the Democrats in the 19th century all about upholding the Constitution?
Mm-hmm.
And then in the 20th century, they're all about the people, Democrats. And in the last few years, aren't the Democrats all about Marxism, or which you might call Bolshevikism? Almost too much. You would expect them to change the name of their party. It's the exact same political progress or game, as you might say. So who are behind the funding of the Bolshevik Party?
Constantly one barrier to mature understanding of recent history is the notion that all capitalists are the bitter and unswerving enemies of all Marxists and socialists. This erroneous idea originated with Karl Marx and was undoubtedly useful to his purposes. In fact, the idea is nonsense. There has been a continuing, albeit concealed, alliance between international political capitalists and international revolutionary socialists to their mutual benefit. This alliance has gone unobserved largely because of historians, with a few notable exceptions, have an unconscious Marxian bias and are thus locked into impossibility of any such alliance existing. The open-minded reader should bear 2 clues in mind. Monopoly capitalists are the bitter enemies of laissez-faire entrepreneurs, and given the weakness of socialist central planning, the totalitarian socialist state is a perfect captive market for monopoly capitalists. If the alliance can be made with a socialist power broker, suppose, and it is only hypothesis at this point, that American monopoly capitalists were able to reduce a planned socialist Russia to the status of a captive technical colony. Would not this be the logical 20th century internationalist extension of the Morgan Railroad monopolies and the Rockefeller Petroleum Trust of the late 19th century? Apart from Gabriel Kolko, Murray Rothbard, and the revisionists, historians have not been alert for such a combination of events. Historical reporting, with rare exceptions, has been forced into
Diarchy?
Excuse me, folks. Dichotomy of capitalists versus socialists. George Kennan's monumental readable study of the Russian Revolution consistently maintains this fiction of a Wall Street Bolshevik dichotomy. Russia leaves the war has a single incidental reference to the J.P. Morgan firm and no reference at all to Guaranty Trust Company. Yet both organizations are promptly mentioned in the State Department files, to which frequent reference is made in this book, and both are part of the core of the evidence presented here. Neither self-admitted Bolshevik banker Olaf Aschberg or Nia Banken in Stockholm is mentioned in Kennan, yet both were essential to Bolshevik funding. Moreover, in minor yet crucial circumstances, at least crucial for our argument, Kennan is factually in error. For example, Kennan cites Federal Reserve Bank Director William Boyce Thompson as leaving Russia on November 27, 1917, This departure state would make it physically impossible for Thompson to be in Petrograd on December 2nd, 1917 to transmit a cable request for $1 million to Morgan in New York. Thompson, in fact, left Petrograd on December 4th, 1918, 2 days after sending the cable to New York. Then again, Kennan states that on November 30th, 1917, Trotsky delivered a speech before the Petrograd Soviet, in which he observed, "Today I had here in the Solomon Institute 2 American closely connected with American capitalist elements." According to Kennan, it is difficult to imagine who those 2 Americans could have been if not Robbins and Gumberg. But in fact, Alexander Gumberg was Russian, not American. Further, as Thompson was still in Russia on November 30th, 1917, then the 2 Americans who visited Trotsky were more than likely Raymond Robbins, a mining promoter turned do-gooder, and Thompson of the Federal Reserve Bank. The Bolshevization of Wall Street was known among well-informed circles as early as 1919. The financial journalist Barron recorded a conversation with oil magnate E. H. Doney in 1919, especially named 3 prominent financiers: William Boyce Thompson, Thomas Lamont, and Charles R. Crane.
Okay, so we can see that there's been a deliberate effort by historians of the revolution to whitewash it and hide the connections. And that can only be because they're in favor of the connections, because you don't hide evidence about your enemies, you hide evidence about your allies. And so if Marxist historians want you to think that New York had nothing to do with their revolution, when State Department, U.S. State Department documents show that they did have something to do with it, it must be that they are fully aware of this collaboration and that they are agents of the New York bankers, not victims or enemies or whatever. And so who are the American Bolsheviks? You mentioned some of these bankers, but is the circle go wider?
Yeah. All right. Bolshevism is the true fruit of socialism. And if you will read the interesting testimony for the Senate committee about the middle of January that showed up all these pacifists and peacemakers as German sympathizers, socialists, and Bolsheviks, you'll see the majority of college professors in the United States are teaching socialism and Bolshevism. That 52 college professors were on so-called peace committees in 1914. President Eliot of Harvard is teaching Bolshevism. The worst Bolsheviks in the United States are not only college professors, of whom President Wilson is one, but capitalists and the wives of capitalists. Neither seem to know what they are talking about. William Boyce Thompson is teaching Bolshevism, and he may yet convert Lamont of J.P. Morgan and Company. Vanderlip is a Bolshevist, so is Charles R. Crane. Many women are joining the movement, and neither they nor their husbands know what it is or what it leads to. Henry Ford is another, and so are most of those 100 historians Wilson took abroad with him in the foolish idea that history can teach you the proper demarcations of races, people, and nations geographically.
So this explains why Saunders, the deputy chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, writes a short letter to Wilson and declares he's in favor of the Soviet system, because he knew Wilson was a Bolshevist like himself, and he wanted to score points with the person who could name him to a higher position. So Wilson, the president of the United States, a Bolshevik, this is before the Russian Revolution even begins now, folks. Okay. So the ideas are not originating in Russia. They're originating in the United States and the West, and that's where the money is. So now, who controlled the Bolshevik Revolution, and why is it important to know this?
This is a letter from, not a letter, but a editorial by Leon Trotsky in New York Times. December 13th, 1938.
Okay, so let me remind you that Leon Trotsky is the iron arm of Lenin. He's the one that is featured in From Russia with Love, that famous film, where you have the guy in the iron train car that's ordering people being shot and arrested everywhere, the vicious communist leader. He is the arch enemy of Admiral Kolchak that we featured in our program some weeks ago. He is one of the chief leaders and one of the most brutal, vicious members of the Bolshevik Party in Russia. So he wrote a letter that got published in what? Did you just say the New York Times Magazine?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you have a date on that?
December 13th, 1938.
Okay.
And it says, "You'll have a revolution, a terrible revolution. What course it takes will depend on much of what Mr. Rockefeller tells Mr. Haig to do. Mr. Rockefeller is a symbol of the American ruling class, and Mr. Haig is a symbol of its political tools."
So he basically says that Rockefeller and Hoggs are planning a Bolshevik revolution in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And the Rockefellers are big backers of the Republican Party. Can you remember Rockefeller was the proposed vice presidential candidate for Nixon in 1960? And he's a big funder of Bill Gates and the vaccines. The Rockefellers founded the Bilderberger Group, you got to remember. And the whole scamdemic is a Bilderberger-Rockefeller plan. So the scamdemic, we all know, is leading to Marxism as complete state control and a complete repression of human liberty, free speech, and even freedom of thought. And he's and Trotsky says he's planning a revolution. So these aren't just, propaganda coming out Trotsky. We'll see that Trotsky's only saying this because this is who funded him. Okay, so let's get on to who was Trotsky and why was he riding in fancy limousines when he was in New York City while living a lower middle class life?
Yeah. You're going to get some numbers here, folks, and they don't match up to how he's riding in these fancy cars. There's no way a normal person would be doing this. How did Trotsky, who knew only German and Russian, survive in capitalist America? According to his autobiography, My Life, my only profession in New York was that of a revolutionary socialist. In other words, Trotsky wrote an occasional articles for Nowy Mir, the New York Russian Socialist Journal. Yet we know that Trotsky family apartment in New York had a refrigerator and a telephone. And according to Trotsky, that the family occasionally traveled in chauffeured limousines. This mode of living puzzled the two young Trotsky boys. When they went into a tea room, the boys would anxiously demand their mother, "Why doesn't the chauffeur come in?" The stylish living standard is also at odds with Trotsky's reported income. The only funds that Trotsky admits receiving in 1916 and 1917 are $310. Instead, Trotsky, "I distributed the $310 among 5 immigrants who were returning to Russia." Yet Trotsky had paid for a first-class cell in Spain. The Trotsky family had traveled across Europe to the United States. They had acquired an excellent apartment in New York, paying rent 3 months in advance, and they had use of a chauffeured limousine. All this on earning of an impoverished revolutionary for a few articles for a low circulation Russian language newspaper, Naše Slovo in Paris and Nové Mir in New York.
Now, I'll point out for those who don't have any memory of 1913s, my relatives immigrated to the United States through New York City, and I had a grandfather who came to New York City in 1907. as a 14-year-old boy with his little sister in hand. And it was impossible to make money as an immigrant. You would be always poor if you stayed in New York. They moved out. His family, that is my Sicilian grandfather, he got a refrigerator in like 55. He got a phone in like 53. So he had to work another 40 years to afford to have a phone and a refrigerator. But Trotsky already has a phone, refrigerator, and a chauffeur.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather didn't even ever buy a car. His wife bought a car in like 52 or 53. So it doesn't make sense. It's just impossible. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This means that big money was behind him. Okay.
Yeah, he goes on. Joseph Avia estimates Trotsky's 1917 income at $12 per week, supplemented by some lecture fees. Trotsky was in New York in 1917 for 3 months. From January to March, so that makes $144 in income from Nove Mur and say another $100 in lecture fees, for a total of $244. Of this $244, Trotsky was able to give away $310 to his friends, pay for the New York apartment, provide for his family, and find the $10,000 that was taken from him in April 1917 by Canadian authorities in Halifax. Trotsky claims that those who said he had other sources of income are slanderers spreading stupid calumnies and lies, but unless Trotsky was playing the horses at Jamaica racetrack, it can't be done. Obviously, Trotsky had an unreported source of income.
Well, I guess if you knew if which horses were going to win, you could make money. But that's just he's a rhetorical flourish he has there. So obviously he was financed by someone, and where did he get these $10,000 from?
Mm-hmm.
What does Sutton say about that?
Most investigation is centered on the variable fact that when Trotsky left New York in 1917 for Petrograd to organize the Bolshevik phase of the revolution, he left with $10,000. In 1919, U.S. Senate Overman Committee investigated Bolshevik propaganda and German money in the United States, incidentally touched on the source of Trotsky's $10,000. Examination of Colonel Herbin, Washington attaché to the Czech legation, the Army in Czech connection.
Well, the Czech legation would have probably been the political bureau representing the newly nascent state of Czechoslovakia, which was being created by the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson was behind it, so it probably doesn't represent the Czech Legion, who were mercenaries, but the nation, the government of Czechoslovakia.
Okay. By the Overman Committee yielded the following. Colonel Herbin, Trotsky perhaps took money from Germany, but Trotsky would deny it. Lenin would not deny it. Milukov proved that he got $10,000 from some Germans while he was in America. Milukov had the proof, but he denied it. Trotsky did, although Milukov had proof. Now, which private bank in New York handled German money?
Well, I can't say we've done serious investigation about this, but I would say that it is coincidental that Brown Brothers Harriman, the bank of the Skull and Bones, and who in these years was just called the Harriman Bank because they didn't acquire Brown Brothers until after the stock market crash in 21, which was organized by the Masons in New York. The Harriman Bank, today called the Brown Brothers Harriman Bank, has branches around the world, but they still have a branch in New York City. It's their headquarters. It's at 100, and I believe it's 150 Broadway. And if you look up 150 Broadway, or maybe it's 160 Broadway, you look up the address on Wikipedia, you'll find that in 2015, that building was bought by a German bank, which was, and if you can't find anything about that German bank in English, but if you go to Wikipedia in German, you'll find that that bank started as a credit union in the 1890s and then expanded across Germany. But to prevent it from going to bankrupt, it was nationalized under the Third Reich and became a state-controlled bank. And somehow it survived the Second World War, and it expanded and merged with others. And now they own the building in which Brown Brothers Harriman Bank has their offices. But the strange thing is the German bank doesn't have any offices in that building. So by renting that building, Brown Brothers Harriman is funneling money to a German bank. And we do know that Brown Brothers Harriman, during the Second World War, or in the years prior to it, is heavily investing and moving funds through Thyssen in Germany, and that had to be through German banks. So we're in the presence here of a possible connection. We know that Harrimans have bit connections with the Germans, and we know that they're also invested in moving or financing this Soviet revolution later on in the story. So, but we have to remember that in 1917, 1916, the US was not yet in the First World War. So we were neutral and therefore could have financial relations with German banks. Once the US enters the war, then that was all cut off. So if you were a Russian, there was no way you're going to get money from a German bank because Russia is at war with Germany. So you'd have to go to a neutral country, which was friends of both and dealing money with both. So it makes sense that Trotsky would go to the United States, but how did he know what bank would facilitate this unless he had some connection with the lodge, the Masonic Lodge? Lenin, I think, if I get my history right, is in 1916 that Lenin goes from Switzerland to Russia, and he's given permission by the highest command in Germany, right up to the Kaiser. So this is probably how Trotsky knew. He had been told by Lenin who were the allies in the US of the German bankers. And he must have gotten that important information while he was traveling through Germany or from the Germans themselves. So this is an international conspiracy. This is not only American bankers. And but I'll point out that Averell Harriman, the founder of the Harriman Bank, was always a leading strategist for the Democrat Party. He was, even though his employees or those that he favored with loans, the Bush and the Trump families were Republicans. So though both of those families were originally Democrat and then converted to become Republicans. Well, maybe they didn't convert. So $10,000. So, but more, we know of the $10,000 because when Trotsky leaves the U.S., his ship puts into port temporarily at Halifax, and some avid policeman arrests the whole lot of them because they're known as Bolshevik revolutionaries, and that was considered a crime. So we know all the names of the people that were on board that ship and how much that money had. That's how we know for certain, as a historical fact, that Trotsky left the U.S. with $10,000. And I've heard other reports that that ship had hundreds of millions of dollars in gold bullion from New York banks too. So how deeper this conspiracy go? What else do we know about people who helped Trotsky?
Oh, we're back to the President Woodrow Wilson. Yeah, gave him a passport.
The American president gave a Russian Marxist Bolshevik an American passport so that he could, get free of Canada after he was arrested in Canada? Or to get into Russia?
Yeah, get into Russia. So, President Woodrow Wilson was the fairy godmother who provided Trotsky with a passport to return to Russia to carry forward the revolution. The American passport was accompanied by a Russian entry permit and a British transit visa. Jennings C. Wise and Woodrow Wilson, disciple of revolution, makes a pertinent comment. Historians must never forget that Woodrow Wilson, despite the effort of the British police, made it possible for Lenin and Trotsky to enter Russia with an American passport.
Yeah, so you have to remember that the Russian government was strongly anti-Marxist. It was czarist, and they certainly wouldn't let Lenin or Trotsky into the country. So they had to get someone to falsify papers from him. And Sutton points out it was the U.S. consulate in Stockholm that made the request to grant Trotsky a U.S. passport. It was done through a foreign consulate to hide it from what people knowing what's going on outside the State Department in the United States. But this is outrageous. The grant, only a U.S. citizen can have a U.S. passport. So,
And at the consulate in Stockholm, what's on his papers?
what is on his papers?
He's a dependable American citizen.
He was not only given a passport, he was given a letter of recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
So in modern terminology of, you would have to say then that the Bolshevik Revolution was a deep state op of the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
And that means the entire Soviet Party and the entire Soviet Union was actually always under the control of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And that they killed 60 million, and that the U.S. deep state is responsible for killing 60 million people.
Yep.
And of starving 20 million Orthodox in the Ukraine to death.
Yep. While we ate on their grain into the
Oh, and
depression.
yeah, we imported their grain too, and we ate it while they starved to death. But that would mean that you wouldn't know anything about this in the U.S. Schools because the deep state would censor it from U.S. education. Wouldn't that be?
Mm-hmm.
And do we know any of this? I mean, did you learn about this in public education?
No.
I didn't learn about it. I went to public education in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
And
This is deeply disturbing, to say the least.
yeah. And we were not allowed to read Animal Farm.
And why do you think that is? What does Animal Farm have to do with all this?
Orwell used Animal Farm to tell what Gareth Jones uncovered.
About the Holodomor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is deeply disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
And we looked into the career of, this is like an aside now, I'll leave aside your question. We looked into the career of Woodrow Wilson. Who was he and why would he be so involved in Bolshevism? But Sutton found out that he actually taught Bolshevism as a professor. You know that Woodrow Wilson got his law degrees without getting a degree. He went to the University of Virginia and he got sick and he never graduated from the University of Virginia. He got his law degree, he studied for the bar. And after marrying a Presbyterian, he goes on to become a professor at Princeton, but he only becomes a professor at Princeton after being a professor at the Wesleyan College in Middletown, Connecticut. He was going from faculty to faculty, which means he wasn't really widely accepted and he wasn't going to get tenure. But after the Wesleyan College, his friends, according to Wikipedia, his friends helped him at Princeton College. Can you imagine all there? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But his friends helped become president of Princeton, and after being president of Princeton, all the political bosses of the Democratic Party pushed for him to become governor of New Jersey. And after just 2 years of governor of New Jersey, he's considered to be the best possible candidate for the Democrat Party, and he wins the nomination in 1914, becomes president of the United States. That sounds like, you know, a star-touched career. Or maybe we should say a lodge-touched career. It sounds like the lodge was completely behind this guy. Sometime after he was in Middletown, Connecticut, which, as an aside, is not really that far from the lodge headquarters, Skull and Bones in New Haven.
Yeah.
So that's just an aside on why maybe Woodrow Wilson was behind calling Trotsky a trustworthy and excellent American citizen. He was neither trustworthy nor an American citizen. And one has to wonder, since Sutton could find this out, and Sutton's books have been published now 20 years or more, 30 years or more, why Russia Today or any publication out of Russia in the English language doesn't expose the fact that the revolution was caused by Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you would expose your enemies, but you would never expose your allies.
Mm-mm.
And so all you who admire Russia out there and think Russia is the great alternate society of the United States, maybe you should rethink your categories. So who was traveling with Trotsky on his way back to Russia, according to the arrest records there in Canada?
Yeah. He was traveling on the SS Christiana Fjord that left New York on March 26, 1917. Trotsky was aboard and holding a U.S. passport in company with other Trotsky revolutionaries, Wall Street financiers, American communists, and other interesting persons, few of whom had embarked for legitimate business. The mixed bag of passengers had been described by Lincoln Stephens, the American communists. The passenger list was long and mysterious. Trotsky was in the steerage with a group of revolutionaries. There was a Japanese revolutionist in my cabin. There were a lot of Dutch hurrying home from Java. The only innocent people aboard. The rest were war messengers, two from Wall Street to Germany. Notably, Lincoln Stephens was on board en route to Russia at a specific invitation of Charles Richard Crane, a backer and former chairman of the Democrat Party's Finance Committee. Charles Crane, vice president of the Crane Company, had organized the Westinghouse Company in Russia, was a member of the route mission to Russia. It had made no fewer than 23 visits to Russia between 1890 and 1930. Richard Crane, his son, was confidential assistant to the Secretary of State Robert Lansing. According to the former ambassador to Germany, William Dodd, Crane did much to bring on the Kerensky Revolution, which gave way to the communism. And so Stephens comments in his diary about the conversations aboard the SS Christian Hoffenford are highly pertinent. All agreed that the revolution is in its first phase only, that it must grow. Crane and Russian radicals on the ship. We shall be in Petrograd for the revolution. In brief, the unlikely and puzzling picture that emerges in that Charles Crane, a friend and backer of Woodrow Wilson, and a prominent financier and politician, had a known role in the first revolution and traveled to Russia in mid-1917 in company with the American Communist Lincoln Stephens, who was both in touch with Woodrow Wilson and Trotsky. The latter in turn was carrying a passport issued after the orders of Wilson and $10,000 from supposed German sources. On his return to the U.S. after the revolution, Crane was granted access to official documents concerning consolidations of the Bolshevik regime. This is a pattern of interlocking, if puzzling, events that warrants further investigation and suggests, though without, at this point, providing evidence, some link between the financier Crane and the revolutionary Trotsky.
Yeah, so Crane played a leading role in organizing what was going on over there. And he's, 23 visits in those number of years means he knew a lot what was going on and knew a lot of people what was going on. He didn't go over as a tourist. Okay. Now, Trotsky and his whole gang there get arrested in Halifax. And how do they get released? How does this chain of events begin? Begins in Washington, D.C., right?
Yeah, it's here. Yeah, it's here. All right. The next document, and these are all documents from the Canadian military, files dated April 7th, and from the Chief of the General Staff, Ottawa, to the Director of Internment Operations and acknowledges a previous letter not in the files about the internment of Russian socialists at Amherst, Nova Scotia. In this connection, we have to inform you of the receipt of a long telegram yesterday from the Russian Consul General, Montreal, protesting against the arrest of these men, as they were in possession of passports issued by the Russian Consul General, New York, USA. The reply to this Montreal telegram was to the effect that the men were interned on suspicion of being German and would be released only upon definite proof of their nationality and loyalty to the Allies. No telegrams from the Russian Consul General in New York are in the Canadian files. It is known that this office was reluctant to issue Russian passports to Russian political exiles. However, there is a telegram in the files from a New York attorney in Alinkoff to R.M. Coulter, then Deputy Postmaster General of Canada. The Postmaster General's office in Canada had no connection with either internment of prisoners of war or military activities. According to this telegram was in nature a personal, non-official intervention. It reads, Dr. R.M. Coulter, Postmaster General, Ottawa. Russian political exiles returning to Russia detained Halifax intern Amherst camp. Kindly investigate and advise cause of detention and names of all detained. Trust as champion of freedom, you will intercede on their behalf. Please wire collect. Nicholas Alinkoff. Then on April 11th, Coulter wired Alinkoff, telegram received, writing you this afternoon. You should receive it tomorrow evening. R.M. Coulter. This telegram was sent by the Canadian Pacific Railway Telegraph, but charged to the Canadian Post Office Department. Normally, a private business telegram would be charged to the recipient, and this was not official business. The follow-up Coulter letter to Alinkoff is interesting because, after confirming that Trotsky's part was held at Amherst, it says that they were suspected of propaganda against the present Russian government and are supposed to be agents of Germany. Coulter then adds, they are not what they represent themselves to be. The Trotsky group is not detained by Canada but by imperial authorities. After assuring Alinkoff that the detainees would be made comfortable, Coulter adds that any information in their favor would be transmitted to the military authorities. The general impression of the letter is that while Coulter is sympathetic and fully aware of Trotsky's pro-German links, he is unwilling to get involved. On April 11th, Arthur Wolfe of 134 East Broadway, New York, sent a telegram to Coulter. Though sent from New York, this telegram, being acknowledged, was also charged to the Canadian Post Office Department. So,
I'll point out that that last letter comes from someone who lives a block or two away from the Harriman Bank. Okay. So Trotsky and his friends all do get released, and who is it? Who is the guy who actually releases them?
Yeah, it is the Major General Willoughby Watkin, stemmed from a long British military tradition. Cambridge, then Staff College. A specialist mobilization, he served in Canada from 1905 to 1918, giving only the documents in Canadian files. We can but conclude that their intervention in behalf of Trotsky is a mystery. But now we're going to get into a little bit of his biography that we found interesting.
Yeah, so Gwatkin, his surname is Gwatkin, a rather unusual name, but it's been present in England, I think, since at least the 17th century. So it is an English name, Gwatkin. But in this one person, you will see the entire international conspiracy elucidated in a way. We'll see, and read his biography.
This one paragraph. By mid-1916, an exhausted Watkin was close to the limit of his extraordinary stock of tact and patience. A confident Charles Frederick Hamilton believed that only the belated dismissal of Hughes permitted his resignation. Glotkin soldiered on under Sir Albert Edward Kemp and the Unionist ministers of militia, Major General Sidney Chilton, Muirborn, and Hugh Guthrie. Having planned and managed as best he could the wartime expansion of the CEF, Glotkin also had to oversee its repatriation,
Repatriation.
demobilization, and recognition as a peacetime force. His plan, submitted in 1917, would have established a permanent army of 20,000 strong, coastal garrisons, universal military service. The British also held him responsible for the Imperial operation in Siberia, where 2 British battalions came under Canadian command at Vladivostok. He retired as a CGS in 1920 with a KCMG.
Knighthood. So the Canadian officer, Canadian British officer, who releases Trotsky is the one who has the command of the two British military units at Vladivostok, who are helping Kolchak.
Mm-hmm.
So he's letting go the Bolshevik to go to Russia to start the revolution that ends up fighting Kolchak in Siberia and killing him.
Yep.
He's if you can't see the signs of the Masonic Lodge there, I mean, what one person would support both sides of the revolution. And he's British. Okay. So he didn't go to Oxford, so we can't say he's a member of the group, okay, which is the Skull and Bones equivalent in England, but he is an officer in the British, he was an officer in the British Imperial Army, and the officers are all Freemasons in England. And so Willoughby, what was his first name? Not Willoughby, Gwatkin.
Sir
Major General.
Sir, yeah, Willoughby Grons Gwatkin.
Gwatkin, okay. Do we know why Trotsky was let go?
Yeah, it will be in this next section by another Canadian military intelligence officer who writes a very good article that Sutton quotes from. In 1918, Colonel McLean wrote for his own McLean magazine an article entitled, "Why Did We Let Trotsky Go? How Canada Lost an Opportunity to Shorten the War." First, Colonel McLean was a man of integrity with an excellent connection in Canadian government intelligence. Second, government records since released by Canada, Great Britain, and the United States confirm McLean's statement to a significant degree. Some McLean statements remain to be confirmed, but information available in the early 1970s is not necessarily inconsistent with Colonel McLean's article. McLean's opening argument is that some Canadian politicians or officials were chiefly responsible for the prolongation of the war, World War I, for the great loss of life, the wounds, the suffering of the winter of 1917, and the great drives of 1918. Further, McLean states that these persons were, in 1919, doing everything possible to prevent Parliament and the Canadian people from getting the related facts. Official reports, including those of Sir Douglas Haig, demonstrate that but for the Russian break in 1917, the war would have been over a year earlier, that the main chiefly responsible for the defection of Russia was Trotsky under German instruction. So according to McLean, Trotsky was not Russian but German. Odd as this assertion may appear, it coincides with the scraps of intelligence information. To wit, that Trotsky spoke better German than Russian, that he was Russian executive of the German Black Bond. According to McLean, Trotsky in August 1914 had been ostentatiously expelled from Berlin. He finally arrived in the United States, where he organized Russian revolutionaries as well as revolutionaries in Western Canada who were largely German and Austrian traveling as Russians, McLean continues. Originally, the British found through Russia's associates at Kerensky, Lenin and some lesser leaders were practically in German pay as early as 1915, and they uncovered in 1916 the connection with Trotsky, then living in New York. From that time, he was closely watched by the bomb squad. In the early part of 1916, a German official sailed from New York. British intelligence officials accompanied him. He was held up in Halifax, but on their instruction he was passed on with profuse apologies for the necessary delay. After maneuvering, he arrived in a dirty little newspaper office in the slums. There found Trotsky, to whom he bore important instructions. From June 1916 until they passed him on to the British, the New York bomb squad never lost touch with Trotsky. They discovered that his real name was Braunstein and that he was a German, not Russian. Such German activity as neutral countries is confirmed in a State Department report number 316-97649, describing organizations as Russian refugees for revolutionary purposes. Continuing, McLean states that Trotsky and four associates sailed on the SS Christiana, and on April 3rd reported to Captain Making, and were taking off the ship at Halifax under the direction of Lieutenant Jones. Actually, a party of 9, including 6 men, were taken off the Christiana Ford. The name of the naval control officer at Halifax was Captain O.M. Bakins. The name of the officer who removed the Trotsky party from the ship is not in the Canadian government documents. Trotsky said it was Mackin. Again, according to McLean, Trotsky's money came from German sources in New York. Also, generally the explanation given is that the release was done at the request of Kerensky, but months before the British officers and one Canadian serving in Russia, who speaks the Russian language, reported to London and Washington that Kerensky was in German services. Trotsky was released at the request of the British Embassy at Washington, which acted on the request of the U.S. State Department, who were acting for someone else. Canadian officials were instructed to inform the press that Trotsky was an American citizen traveling on an American passport, that his release was specially demanded by the Washington State Department. Moreover, writes McLean, in Ottawa, Trotsky had continued to have strong underground influence. There, his power was so great that orders were issued that he must be given every consideration. Now, this is a letter, March 9th, 1918, to American Consul Vladivostok from Polk, Acting Secretary of State, Washington, D.C. For your confidential information and prompt attention, following is the substance of message of January 12th from von Schantz of German Imperial Bank to Trotsky. Quote, constant Imperial Bank to appropriation from Credit General Staff of 5 million rubles for sending Assistant Chief Naval Commissioner Kudryashov to Far East. This message suggests some liaison between Trotsky and Germans in January 1918, a time when Trotsky was proposing an alliance with the West. The State Department does not give the provenance of the telegram, only that it originated with the War College staff. The State Department did treat the message as authentic and acted on the basis of assumed authenticity. It is consistent with the general theme of Colonel McLean's article.
Okay, so none of this makes sense unless you add the missing piece. And the missing piece is that the Skull and Bones Lodge was a daughter lodge of a Masonic lodge in Berlin. And the Masonic lodge in Berlin had already organized the entire German Wehrmacht and the imperial government of the Prussian state. And this is why Trotsky is a German, and Braunstein, and why he gets ostentatiously expelled from Berlin. That creates his cover. He has power in Ottawa because he's like this with the Masonic lodges, and they're all working together to destroy the Russian Orthodox people. Okay, that's their target. And that was the plan, because they knew Russia was extremely wealthy in minerals, and they wanted slave labor to exploit that, to bring down the prices of minerals around the world and control markets. This is what the whole strategy was. And then it makes sense, because otherwise it makes no sense, okay? And this puts a big obligation upon all Americans to investigate this and find the guilty parties and do justice for the 60 million people who have been killed.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not surprising that the same lodge that so easily killed 60 million in Russia has been promoting 60 million murders in the United States and abortion. They're just mass murderers, these people. They're absolutely psychopathic.
Mm-hmm.
So what was Trotsky's intentions and objectives in traveling into the United States, and according to Sutton's investigations? Did he come here knowing he was going to get help?
Yeah. Trotsky traveled from New York to Petrograd on a passport supplied by the intervention of Woodrow Wilson, and with the declared intention to carry forward the revolution. The British government was the immediate source of Trotsky's release from Canadian custody in April 1917, but there may have well been pressures. He put that in, Sutton put that in quotes. Lincoln's stipends and American communists acted as a link between Wilson and Charles R. Crane, and between Crane and Trotsky. Further, while Crane had no official position, his son Richard was confidential assistant to Secretary of State Robert Lansing, and Crane Sr. was provided with prompt and detailed reports on the progress of the Bolshevik Revolution. Moreover, Ambassador William Dodd, U.S. Ambassador to Germany in the Hitler era, said that Crane had active role in the Kerensky phase of the revolution, and Stipend's letter confirmed that Crane saw the Kerensky phase as only one step in the continuing revolution.
Yeah, you would expect Americans to want the revolution to have ended in the summer of 1917 because it had set up a democratic parliamentary form of government. But that's not what the Democrats in the United States wanted. They call themselves Democrats, but that is only a cover for what they're really up to. So how did the Kaiser and his general staff help Lenin and Trotsky get to Russia? And just to elucidate to everyone, remind you again, a German agent to infiltrate Russia and bring it down could not travel from Germany to Russia because they're at war. So he had to travel to a neutral country like the US that was neutral also to Russia. And so this is what makes the geopolitical necessary. But the Kaiser and his general staff, who were the people involved in letting Lenin and Trotsky go to Russia, or at least sending them to Russia?
Well, my German's getting to work out today. I haven't read this much German in a while. Okay, this is a letter from von Kuhlmann, Minister of Foreign Affairs, to the Kaiser himself, December 3rd, 1917. It was not until the Bolsheviks had received from us a steady flow of funds through various channels, under varying labels, that they were in position to be able to build up their main organ bravada.
Now that is their death squad that were around massacring everyone in the capital.
To conduct energetic propaganda and appreciably to extend the original narrow base of their party. Okay, and now we're going to get into Lenin here. And this is in April 1917. Lenin and the party of 32 Russian revolutionaries, mostly Bolsheviks, journeyed by train from Switzerland across Germany through Sweden to Petrograd, Russia. They were on their way to join Lenin and Trotsky to complete the revolution. The Trans-Germany transit was approved, facilitated, and financed by the German General Staff. Lenin's transit to Russia was part of the plan approved by the German Supreme Command, apparently not immediately known to the Kaiser, to the aid in the disintegration of the Russian army. and so eliminate Russia from World War One. The possibility that the Bolsheviks might be turned against Germany in Europe did not occur to the German General Staff. Major General Hoffmann has written, "We neither knew nor foresaw the danger to humanity from the consequences of the journey of the Bolsheviks revolution." What a way to cover their rear end.
You know, they knew it all along because they're Freemasons. Yeah, they have to cover for themselves because of this liars. The Masonic method of operation is to get a traitor and use him to steal your loyalty. So they got Trotsky, a German. They gave him a Russian name. They sent him to Russia to steal the loyalty of the Russian people, to turn it against themselves, to destroy their own nation, and then to use that loyalty to destroy nations around the world. All the while making money for American bankers and who sell military hardware. And now you know where all those 2.3 trillion from the Pentagon has disappeared to.
Yeah.
And
And
why all of a sudden Russia became such a wonderful, strong military power, even though it didn't have the resources of the United States.
and it goes all the way to the top just before the Kaiser. At the highest level of the German political officer who approved Lenin's journey to Russia was Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann Hallwig, a descendant of the Frankfurt banking family Bethmann, which achieved great prosperity in the 19th century. Bethmann Hallwig was appointed chancellor in 1909, and in November 1913 became the subject of the first vote of censure ever passed by the German Reichstag on a chancellor. It was Bethmann Hallwig who in 1914 told the world that the German guarantee to Belgium was a mere scrap of paper. Yet on other war matters, such as the use of unrestricted submarine warfare, Bethmann Hallwig was ambivalent. In January 1917, he told the Kaiser, "I can give you, Your Majesty, either my assent to the unrestricted submarine warfare, nor my refusal." By 1917, Bethmann Hallwig had lost the Reichstag's support and resigned, but not before approving transit of Bolshevik revolutionaries to Russia. The transit instruction from Bethmann Hallwig went through the State Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, who was immediately under Bethmann Hallwig and who handled day-to-day operational details, with the German ministers in both Bern and Copenhagen, to the German minister to Bern in early April 1917. The Kaiser himself was not aware of the revolutionary movement until after Lenin had passed into Russia. While Lenin himself did not know the precise source of the assistance, he certainly knew that German government was providing some funding. There were, however, intermediate links between the German Foreign Ministry and Lenin, as the following shows.
So Theobald Theodor Friedrich Alfred von Bethmann Hollweg is the Chancellor of Germany from 19. He was Chancellor of Germany from 14th of July 1909 to the 13th of July 1917. So just as he's going out of office, he's doing his little Masonic deed and approving Lenin and Trotsky to go to Russia. So banking family, Frankfurt. You know, there's another famous banking family from the Frankfurt region. Not saying they're related or anything, but the Rothschilds,
Oh, yeah.
who are behind, they're also from that part of the area too. So we haven't yet done any kind of research into the Masonic lodges in Germany. It's a bit more difficult to do since most of the information is in German, but I just, you know, to use the phrase, I'd bet my buttons at least. This has a lot to do with it. So this is how the Russian Revolution gets going. It's an alliance between German authorities, American authorities, the Democratic Party in America, and New York City bankers. And this is something we should all find very disturbing. I think the first thing is this needs to be taught to everyone. Needs to learn this real history. and then it needs to be in public schools, because we need to start asking ourselves how long we've been victims of the deep state, and how many people around the world have been victims of the deep state. It's not only a question of saving our own nation now, it's saving all nations, because there's something very evil in New York City. And it's not the city, and it's not the people, it's not even the banks, it's the Masonic Lodge. It's Brown Brothers Harriman.
Yeah. This last page before it ends, pretty much. This last page and the last little bit of information. It's gives you a lot of who's in control. From Berlin, Zimmermann and Bethmann Holloway communicated with a German minister in Copenhagen, Brockdorff Rantzau. In turn, Brockdorff Rantzau was in touch with Alexander Israel Helfand, more commonly known by his alias, Parvus, who was located in Copenhagen. Parvus was the connection to Jacob Furstenberg, a Pole descended from a wealthy family but better known by his alias Gnadsky, and Jacob Furstenberg was an immediate link to Lenin. Although Chancellor Bethmann Holloway was the final authority for Lenin's transfer, and although Lenin was probably aware of the German origins of the assistance, Lenin cannot be termed a German agent. The German Foreign Ministry assessed Lenin's probable action in Russia as being consistent with their objectives in the dissolution of the existing power and structure in Russia. Yet both parties also had hidden objectives. Germany wanted priority access to the post-war markets in Russia, and Lenin intended to establish a Marxist dictatorship. The idea of using Russian revolutionaries in this way can be traced back to 1915. On August 14th of that year, Brockdorff Rantzau wrote the German State Undersecretary about the conversation with Helfand and made a strong recommendation to employ Helfand. An extraordinary important man whose unusual powers I feel we must employ for duration of the war. Included in the report was a warning. It might perhaps be risky to want to use the powers arrangement behind Helfand, but it would certainly be an admission of our own weakness if we were to refuse their services out of fear of not being able to direct them. Brockdorff Rantzau's idea was directing or controlling the revolutionaries parallel, as we shall see, those of the Wall Street financiers. It was J.P. Morgan, an American international corporation, that attempted to control both domestic and foreign revolutionaries in the United States for their own purposes.
This has been a very enlightening program, AJ, and thank you for having me host it. And very informative. I think every American needs to listen to this, and every student in the United States needs to listen to this information. And we're only briefly summarizing the contents of Sutton's book in its first 3 chapters. The involvement of New York bankers, American bankers in the Russian Revolution after the revolution begins, and in everything throughout its whole history is mind-blowing, and we'll cover it in future programs. So if you like these kind of historical programs we're offering at Ordo Militaris Radio TV, please consider making a donation to this apostolate. You can do that using the button at the bottom of any page for any show. You can make a free will offering one time, or you could make it in a recurring way, and you can use your credit card to do that. And we thank you for it. It doesn't go to our salaries. We don't get a salary from this. It goes just to buy equipment so we can produce a better quality program. And thank you for your support. And for those who are already pledging, we thank you.
Yep. This is Ordo Militaris Radio TV signing off. Deus Volt.
Deus Volt.